Thanks for listening to this episode of History's Greatest Battles. If you're not yet, please subscribe. And if you enjoy these episodes, don't hesitate to share them with a friend. History is full of mysteries, and the farther back, the further we have to stretch our minds to accept what was written and accepted as truth in the past. Whether it was divinely supernatural or such a well-crafted conspiracy of power that it has remained in the shadows to modern day is anyone's guesses. But the figurehead of today's episode changed Europe's history, launching England into its eventual maritime empire and France into an acceptance of absolutism, the divine right of their monarchs. Let's now experience Joan of Arc's Battle of Orleans.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 39, The Battle of Orleans, from the 12th of October, 1428, to the 7th of May, 1429. French forces, 2,400 garrison soldiers, 3,000 armed civilians, and a 4,000-strong relief force by Joan of Arc. English forces, 5,000 soldiers. Joan of Arc, a beacon of divine conviction, breathed life into a nation on the brink of collapse. Where once the French wavered under the crushing force of English dominance, her presence alone shattered their enemies' momentum. The tide of the 100 Years' War, long a tale of French despair, now surged with newfound hope as her unyielding resolve turned the advantage slowly but surely into France's hands.
The 100 Years' War unfolded like a relentless duel, where neither England nor France could hold the upper hand for long, as the fortunes of battle veered sharply between them. Edward III of England struck hard at Crecy, carving a path of early triumph for England, yet even his sword was no match for the black tide of the bubonic plague, which brought the war to a choking halt, leveling the field by stealing life from both sides. As the Black Death swept through France and England, it didn't just claim lives. It reshaped the very fabric of society, twisting the old order beyond recognition. The countryside bled empty, as farmers succumbed to death or fled to the cities, leaving the once mighty feudal lords clutching at the ruins of their vanishing wealth. Meanwhile, the cities swelled with new life, their streets teeming with opportunity as coffers overflowed, igniting a frenzied surge of wealth. The shadow of death fueled a feverish appetite for luxury, as desperate citizens sought to indulge in life's fleeting pleasures, filling the pockets of merchants and artisans with gold. As the manorial estates crumbled, the king turned his gaze to the rising wealth of the townsfolk, seeking their coin to fund his royal ambition, chief among them, the relentless demands of war. No longer bound to the whims of feudal lords, soldiers became mercenaries of the crown, while the aristocracy watched their fortunes dwindle, their grip on their former power slipping away. More crucial still, the incomprehensible plague drove the masses into the arms of the church, seeking divine answers to the chaos that ravaged their world. As the populace's desperation grew, so too did the church's dominion, rising to unmatched authority as faith tightened its hold on the shaken masses. Whispers of divine wrath echoed through Europe, with some cursing God's vengeance and others lashing out at scapegoats like the Jews, while in France, the blame was heaped upon the English. But one thing united them all: a conviction that salvation must come from the heavens. As the plague ravaged on, war itself took a grim pause, and the hard-won English conquests crumbled into dust. In the void left by England's retreat, the momentum shifted to France. In 1413, Henry V ascended the English throne with a brazen declaration. The French crown, too, would be his, echoing the bold claim of Edward III before him. With the crushing victory at Agincourt in 1415, Henry seized the French crown from the hand of Charles VI's heir, reigning over both England and France in a moment of unmatched conquest. Yet Henry's sudden death in 1422 shattered this fragile dominance, reopening the bloody question of who would claim the throne of France. The English crowned Henry's infant son as their king, while the French rallied behind the weak but rightful son of Charles VI, Charles VII. Though Charles VII had the royal blood to claim the crown, he possessed little else: no courage, no will to lead. Though Charles VII officially claimed the throne, he ruled in name alone, his feeble character incapable of command. As Charles wavered, the Duke of Bedford, regent for England's Henry VI, seized the moment to tighten England's grip on France once more. Bolstered by an alliance with the mighty Duchy of Burgundy, Bedford extended English control over all of France north of the Loire, locking the nation in an iron fist. The pendulum swung fully in England's favor. Decades of war, plague, and France's spineless leadership seemed to conspire to doom the kingdom. All hope seemed lost, and the people of France, broken and desperate, looked only to the heavens for salvation. Then, into this storm of despair strode Joan of Arc. Born to a modest yet comfortable family in the province of Lorraine, her early life appeared unremarkable until destiny called her in her teenage years. At 13, Joan began to hear voices, which she fervently believed were the commands of Saint Margaret, Saint Catherine, and the Archangel Michael himself. By 17, those same voices had charged her with a divine mission to liberate France and compel the feckless Charles VII to rise from his cowardice and seize the throne. Joan's divine summons came just as Bedford prepared to launch his next wave of English assaults against the battered French forces. With northern France firmly in English hands, Bedford set his sights on Armagnac, the fertile lands south of the Loire, determined to expand his dominion. Orleans, a formidable bastion along the Loire, became his first and most crucial target. On October the 12th, 1428, the English forces, led by the Earl of Salisbury, marched on Orleans. With only 5,000 men, they began a siege, encircling the city with determination despite their limited numbers. The English aimed their first strike at the fortified bridge spanning the Loire. On October the 24th, they took it, but the price was steep. Salisbury himself was cut down in the blood-soaked assault. Leadership shifted quickly in the wake of Salisbury's death, with the Earl of Suffolk taking command briefly before John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, replacing him in December, a warrior renowned for his ruthless tenacity. The English unleashed a relentless barrage of artillery upon Orleans, yet their stone cannonballs shattered harmlessly against the fortress's unyielding walls, barely scratching the city's ancient defenses. Their limited numbers made a full encirclement of Orleans impossible, forcing the English to erect a network of small forts around the bridge and their encampments, fortifying their grip while waiting for the city to starve into submission. Desperate French raiding parties occasionally slipped through the English lines to bring in meager supplies, but by the spring of 1429, the people of Orleans were gasping under the weight of hunger and despair. It was this besieged city, on the brink of collapse, that Joan of Arc had been divinely commanded to rescue. With the help of her uncle, a seasoned soldier, Joan secured an escort to Chinon, where for a grueling month, churchmen and military officials interrogated her endlessly before she finally earned an audience with Charles. Why Charles, a dithering king, would grant command of an army to a teenage girl remains a historical mystery, though his weaknesses for fortune tellers and mystics likely swayed him toward this strange emissary claiming to hear voices from the heavens. Despite the doubts swirling around her, Joan was named co-commander alongside the Duke of Alençon, entrusted with 4,000 troops, a force now bound to her audacious cause. Marching toward Orleans, Joan boldly sent the English a letter, commanding them to withdraw under divine authority. Predictably, the English mocked her demand, dismissing it with contempt. Guided by her voices, Joan insisted on entering Orleans from the north, defying her officers who balked at the idea of facing the English head-on in such a bold maneuver. But undeterred, she rallied the men to ferry her and the army across the Loire, slipping between the city and the English stronghold at Saint-Loup, her determination overriding their fears. Leading her soldiers north under the cover of night, Joan waited with calm resolve. Then on April the 29th, 1429, she marched them back and triumphantly entered Orleans through the very gate foretold by her visions. To this point, Joan had followed every command from her divine voices with startling precision, meeting barely any resistance from the English at all. Days passed in uneasy stillness as the defenders within Orleans hesitated, unwilling to strike at their formidable English enemies. But Joan, unshaken, promised them divine protection under God's banner. Upon hearing of English reinforcements, she ordered her men to notify her the moment they arrived, threatening to behead the commander of the Orleans garrison if they failed her. On May the 1st, after a brief truce, Joan sprang from her sleep, declaring with fierce conviction that the moment for battle had come. Strapping on her gleaming armor with swift purpose, Joan mounted her white horse and rode out of the city, a living symbol of divine French resolve. When she reached the field, she saw that a French assault on the English fort at St. Loup was underway and faltering. Joan charged into the fray, her presence igniting the French with new fervor. Under her rallying cry, they stormed the fort, and St. Loup fell. The French counted only 2 dead, while the English defenders were utterly annihilated, leaving nobody alive to tell the tale. Joan ordered the entire army to offer prayers of gratitude and confess their sins, sweeping away any hint of vice by expelling the prostitutes who trailed behind the soldiers. On the Feast of the Ascension, she forbade any combat, but with unwavering certainty she proclaimed that within 5 days the English would be gone. Joan's final plea to the English for their withdrawal was met with vile taunts, leaving her no choice but to ready her forces for battle. Yet on May 5th, Joan burst forth from the city's southern gate, her forces charging toward the critical bridge, whose southern end had been seized by the English in the early days of the siege. Rather than assault the heavily defended bridge, Joan led her troops through the Loire shallows, reaching a small island before crossing to the southern bank on hastily assembled boat bridges. The French stormed the fort at Saint-Jean-le-Blanc with swift brutality, then pressed onward, their eyes set on the imposing fortress at Les Augustins, which loomed near the bridge. The battle for Les Augustins raged fiercely, with blood spilled on both sides, but it was Joan who led the decisive charge, driving the English back into their own fort until the stronghold crumbled into French control. On May the 6th, the French set their sights on Les Tournelles, the twin towers guarding the southern edge of the bridge, launching an all-out assault. Amid the chaos of battle, an arrow struck Joan, and she was carried from the front lines, her warriors fearing the loss of their divine leader. But the wound proved shallow, and by late afternoon, Joan, unbowed and unbroken, returned to the battlefield, her spirit as fierce as ever. After a brief 10 minutes spent in fervent prayer, Joan rallied her weary men once more, leading them into a fresh assault that sent the English scrambling back into the protective walls of their towers. The next day, on May the 7th, a bold French knight seized Joan's sacred banner and made straight for Les Tournelles, determined to lead the charge. Joan attempted to halt his reckless advance, but the sight of her banner stirred the soldiers to action, and they surged forward, eager to follow its lead. With assault ladders in hand, the French swarmed the walls, Joan herself leading the furious climb toward the battlements. The fort of 500 English defenders, caught in the ferocity of the French assault, attempted to flee, but they met their fiery end as the burning bridge, their sole escape route, crumbled beneath them. By the next day, the English, with their spirits broken, abandoned the siege entirely. The triumphant French swept back into Orleans, slaughtering or capturing every English soldier who remained stranded on the southern bank. On May the 9th, as the English torched their camps and withdrew, many of Joan's men thirsted to pursue the retreating enemy, but she forbade them with her unwavering authority. It was Sunday, a sacred day, and Joan reminded her troops that battle could only be justified in defense, not pursuit. However, by Monday, her soldiers unleashed their fury, launching a raid on the retreating English, capturing artillery and vital supplies in their wake. Upon hearing of Orleans' liberation, Charles basked in the glory, shamelessly claiming full credit for the victory and omitting any mention of Joan in his proclamations. But the people of France knew the truth, and as Joan's legends spread, the ranks of the French army swelled with eager recruits. Joan marched onward, leading relentless attacks against English garrisons, liberating town after town, her victories stacking up as quickly as her fame. On June the 18th, Joan confronted Shrewsbury's forces, bolstered by 1,000 fresh mercenaries, but she showed no sign of hesitation as she led the charge. In a devastating blow, her 6,000 troops cut down 4,000 Englishmen, obliterating Shrewsbury's army in a thunderous rout. The following day at Patay, the French turned the tables on an English ambush, catching them off guard and routing them once more. Shrewsbury himself was captured, his arrogance brought low. Quote, "Beyond the tactical triumphs at Orleans and Patay, the French had finally unraveled the iron grip of England's war machine, which had brought mighty France to the brink of annihilation. Most obviously, this solution lay in the release of moral forces. In hoc signo vinces, meaning in this sign conquer, can be quite as useful a military weapon as a sword or a cannon," end quote. From Pratt in the Battles That Changed History. After these victories, Joan pressed Charles to march towards Reims, the city of coronations, urging him to claim his rightful crown as the King of France. With Joan at the helm, the French forces escorted Charles, sweeping through the city of Troyes, which surrendered without a single drop of blood shed from its Burgundian defenders. Reims, too, lay in Burgundian hands, and the French lacked the siege equipment to take it by force. Yet Joan's confidence remained unshaken. She commanded her soldiers to, quote, "advance boldly and fear nothing," end quote. And once again the city surrendered without a fight, as if fate itself bowed to her. On July the 16th, 1429, Charles was finally crowned King of France, a victory that cemented the legitimacy of his reign. Emboldened by her string of victories, Joan turned her sights on Paris, held by the Burgundians. This time, though, there were no divine voices to guide her, only her fierce determination to reclaim the city for France. In the thick of battle, an arrow struck Joan's leg, but even as she fought through the pain, Charles, ever the cautious king, ordered a retreat, pulling the French forces back from the brink of capturing the city. With Charles disbanding his army in 1430, Joan was left with only a small band of loyal followers, too few to achieve the grand vision that her voices had once promised her. In a cruel twist of fate, Joan was captured by the Burgundians, and Charles, the very king she had crowned, refused to ransom his most loyal warrior, abandoning her to her captors. Joan was sold into the hands of the English, who wasted no time in branding her a witch, a heretic, determined to break the spirit of France by destroying its living symbol of hope. The trial was a travesty of justice, a preordained farce designed to seal her fate. On May the 30th, 1431, Joan was condemned to the flames, burned alive at the stake. Despite the English bending the trial to their will, not a single witness could be found to testify against her, a glaring testament to her innocence. Though the world knows her of Joan of Arc, in France she remains Jean, the young woman who defied empires and carved her name into history. Though her life was brief and meticulously chronicled, the enigma of Joan's rise and fall continues to defy full understanding. The origins of the voices that guided her and the radiant visions that she could see remain one of history's most haunting questions. Whatever the true source of her visions, to the people of her time, the heavenly explanation was the only truth that mattered. In an age where anything extraordinary was met with suspicion and fear, Joan convinced both the learned and the common folk that she was chosen by God himself, carrying the weight of a nation's salvations on her shoulders. In a land still trembling from the aftermath of the Black Death, where faith in God had become the final refuge, the people saw Joan as a true emissary of the divine, sent to lead them from ruin. Armored in gleaming white, astride her majestic white horse and carrying a banner embroidered with the words, Jesus Maria, flanked by angels, Joan became the living embodiment of purity and divine favor. Her soldiers called her La Pucelle, the Virgin, a name that captured both her chastity and her holiness. For a people who had lost all hope and believed only a miracle could deliver France from the jaws of destruction, Joan was that miracle incarnate. What else could explain why battle-hardened veterans followed her into the thick of combat, submitting without question to her strict orders to abandon their vices and purify themselves for the cause? Whether the voices that guided Joan were divine or something else entirely, the undeniable truth is that her achievements defy reason. If not divinely inspired, then she was the most fortunate warrior ever to set foot on a battlefield. Joan, a mere girl, persuaded her uncle, a seasoned soldier, to bring her before the local garrison commander, an extraordinary feat in itself. She then managed to convince this hardened commander to grant her a military escort to meet with the Dauphin, Charles, a request that would have been absurd under normal circumstances. For 11 days, Joan and her escort rode through hostile lands, cutting through enemy territory without being stopped once, as if fate itself had cleared her path. After enduring a month of intense scrutiny from clerics, all of whom found no reason to doubt her divine claims, she was finally granted an audience with Charles. To test her, Charles switched clothes with the courtier and hid among the crowd. Yet when Joan entered, she unerringly walked up to him, bowing and addressing him as king, her certainty leaving the court in stunned silence. After only 5 minutes of private conversation, Joan persuaded the wavering Dauphin to place an army under her command, a decision that would alter the course of history. As she prepared to leave for Orleans, Joan sent a cryptic message to St. Catherine's Church in Faubourg, instructing them to dig beneath the altar. There, exactly as she foretold, they uncovered a hidden sword, a relic known only to her, though she had never set foot in the town. Joan had never visited Faubourg, and the locals were entirely unaware of the ancient blade buried beneath their very church, further solidifying her mystique. Joan, despite eating scarcely more than a pauper, wore her gleaming armor with ease, often for days at a time, her endurance nearly supernatural. Seasoned warriors who had survived decades of war followed her without hesitation, obeying the commands of this 17-year-old girl who had never seen the inside of a battle before, yet carried herself like a seasoned general. When her forces needed to sail upriver past the English position on the Loire, both the wind and the current stood against them. Yet at her word, the winds miraculously reversed, filling their sails and propelling them upriver as if nature itself bent to her will. Ignoring the counsel of her seasoned officers, Joan pressed forward, determined to enter Orleans through the north gate as her voices commanded. Though the English had previously blocked this very path, the moment she arrived, they were nowhere to be seen, as if her presence alone had driven them away. After the ferocity of her first battle, Joan's compassion surfaced as she knelt beside a dying English soldier, cradling him in her arms as his life slipped away, her mercy a stark contrast to the horrors of war. Joan had boldly declared that the English siege would collapse within 5 days, and true to her word, the enemy broke their hold on Orleans as if fate itself bowed to her prophecy. Joan faced the furnace of countless battles, yet she never raised a sword. Clutching only her sacred banner, she stood as a beacon for her troops, untouched by the violence that raged around her. 2 cities surrendered without a single strike, their defenders disarmed not by steel, but by the sheer force of Joan's presence, as if her holiness alone had conquered them. At her trial, over 600 witnesses gave testimony, yet not a single voice rose against her. Even in the face of her enemies, Joan's honor remained untainted. Of the 42 prosecuting attorneys, 39 openly pleaded for clemency, recognizing the injustice that stained the very trial they conducted. Though Charles, the king she had crowned, abandoned her to the English, Joan never uttered a word of bitterness. She bore her fate with quiet dignity, her faith unshaken even as the fires of betrayal burned around her. Joan's strategy, more than any weapon or army, altered the destiny of the war itself, tilting the balance irrevocably in France's favor. She tore apart the old, disastrous strategies the French had clung to for decades, forsaking the futile frontal assaults that had cost them so dearly against the entrenched English. Under Joan's direction, the French marched to victory after victory, her vision transforming them from a broken army into an unstoppable force. But her greatest weapon was not steel. It was the fire she ignited in the hearts of her countrymen. More than any battlefield victory, it was this surge of belief that finally broke the English. After the liberation of Orleans and the triumph at Patay, the tide of war shifted. The once mighty English war machine faltered, its momentum bleeding away under Joan's relentless advance. Though the war staggered on for another 2 decades, the battle for France had, in truth, been decided at Orleans, where the future of the kingdom was written in victory. It's nothing short of a miracle that despite Charles's abysmal leadership, the fighting spirit of France survived the loss of Joan, a testament to the enduring flame she had kindled in her people. Internal strife between the English and the Burgundian allies did as much to erode English power as Joan's victories on the battlefield, their alliances unraveling in the wake of her legacy. It's no surprise that the Catholic Church canonized her in 1920, for few in France would question the holiness that had defined her life, a life that lifted a nation from the ashes. If England had triumphed and held France in its grasp, the course of history would have bent dramatically. The fate of both nations, and perhaps all of Europe, would have been irrevocably altered. Such a conquest might have rivaled the impact of the Norman invasion of 1066, reshaping the cultural and political landscape in ways that we can only speculate. The British, already entrenching their rule in northern France, relied heavily on French bureaucrats to govern, a curious reversal that hinted at the merging of 2 distinct identities. Had English monarchs fully embraced these French advisors and its functionaries, it's possible that their influence might have reshaped English governance itself. This blending of systems could have profoundly affected the future of English democracy and its vast holdings abroad. France's resurgence, forged in the fires of Joan's intervention, shattered the course Europe was hurtling down. Her victories didn't just revive a nation, they altered the entire political trajectory of the continent. Before Joan, England teetered on the edge of absolute victory, poised to crush France into a mere vassal. With that triumph, Europe might have been reshaped into an orbit around English supremacy, with France bound in subjugation. But with Joan's flame igniting the French resurgence, England's grip faltered. This collapse allowed the Valois dynasty to tighten its hold, heralding France's ascension as a military titan in the coming centuries. Joan's role as the savior of France did more than win battles. She breathed life into a fledgling national identity, uniting the people under a banner of sacred destiny. The French no longer fought merely for a monarch. They fought for the soul of their nation, convinced that France was marked for greatness by divine will. This nascent nationalism became the engine that drove France's ambitions across Europe, stoking the fires of rivalry and conquest that would burn through the early modern period. Meanwhile, England, shaken by its loss of French soil, turned its gaze to the oceans. The fall of its empire on the continent birthed a new hunger, though one that would propel it to build a naval force that would reach across the globe, sowing the seeds of a world-spanning empire. Without Joan's intervention, England might have solidified its continental holdings, standing tall as a major power in Europe. Instead, her victories forced England to look beyond Europe's shores, setting it on the path to imperial domination far from home. This dramatic shift in England's ambitions reshaped the balance of power in Europe. sparking the fierce rivalries that would define the colonial era as nations raced to carve out empires across the globe. Joan's meteoric ascent, followed by her tragic fall, reverberates through history, standing as one of the defining moments that altered the destiny of nations. Her legacy is etched in the hearts of her people, a living symbol of courage, unwavering faith, and unbreakable patriotism. Her influence stretches far beyond the battlefield. Her canonization, nearly 5 centuries after she perished in the flames, stands as a testament to the timeless power of her story, a story that continues to shape the very identity of France itself. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, was more than a warrior or a saint. She was France's unyielding will made flesh.